I had actually asked around, how do you do a one-man play for 25,000 people? I know how to do it. I've done it many times when I can see the people, look at their faces, I watch their reactions. But you come out on the stage and there are a bunch of cameras and the audience is completely in the dark. And by the way, the performance before me was Leanne Rimes. The fear in my mind was that 10,000 people are going to decide they need to go to the restroom when I come out. And I knew I had to grab the audience. I had to hold them.
What's up, guys? Thanks for tuning into the Why Influence podcast, where we interview influencers about their why and their motivation for influencing. I'm your host, Jeremy Siegel. Today, our guest is Gene Griessman. He's a very unique public speaker. He's developed a one-man show where he dresses up like Abe Lincoln and gives performances being Abe Lincoln. Notice I didn't say acting like Abe Lincoln. He actually becomes Abe Lincoln during his performance. He's spoken to live audiences of over 25,000 people while doing this act. Prior to that, he had a career interviewing some of the world's most influential people, such as Ronald Reagan, Ray Charles, Aaron Copland, Jack Nicklaus, and several other presidents and movie stars. Without giving any more spoilers, let's jump into the interview.
Welcome to the Why Influence podcast, where we deep dive into the why behind some of the world's most influential people. Why do you influence? Why are you an influencer? We hope to inspire you to share your voice with the world. And now, your host, Jeremy Siegel.
Gene, thanks for coming on the show. Before we jump into your why, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your background so our audience can learn a little bit more about you.
All right, ask away.
What did you do before you were Abe Lincoln?
All right, I will abbreviate it. When I was a teenager, I thought I would be a missionary to Africa. Studied for the ministry, have 2 theological degrees. Then I got a PhD in sociology with a minor in anthropology. So for several years, I taught at big universities. I have taught at the College of William and Mary, North Carolina State University. I was head of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Auburn University. I taught abroad as a Fulbright professor of anthropology, National Graduate University of Pakistan, for an academic year. I have been a visiting researcher at the Agrarian University of Peru and the University of New South Wales in Australia, and I finished my academic career at Georgia Tech. So I was a professor of sociology, anthropology.
Okay. And so how did you come across this Abe Lincoln thing? Like, what's the story behind that?
All right, the story behind my Abraham Lincoln one-man show. When I was at Auburn University, I, an historian, wrote a proposal that was funded at a very high level, and we did a major program conference and follow-on the future of the South. And I got the television component. And so I started doing television shows. What my part was that I would host town meetings of the air that would air on all the public television stations of Alabama. And it would be 3 hours long. There would be statewide telephone call in. We would have a panel. We'd have a live audience. So I hosted those shows, 4 of them. It won an award, and I thought this will work on commercial television. So I took a demo video up to Atlanta, showed it around. Ted Turner's people liked it a lot. And so they asked me if I would come on board and produce content for Ted Turner's network. It wasn't a network at that time, it was just one station that was carried on cable. It eventually, of course, became much more CNN and the Superstation and the Comedy Channel, but in those days it was just TBS. And so I did shows, I hosted television specials, although this time it was much larger. It would be a nationwide audience with nationwide telephone call-in. Once in that door, I thought, why don't I do oral history? That's the academic side of me. Why don't I do oral history with very famous people? And they liked that idea. Only they said, let's call it celebrity interviews. And we named it Up Close. I thought of the name and we called it Up Close. And so for over a dozen years, I interviewed very famous people, from Ronald Reagan to Ray Charles, Hank Aaron to Aaron Copland, Jack Nicklaus, Mary Kay, just a number of very famous people from disparate parts of the celebrity spectrum. I gradually became aware that whether I was talking to Aaron Copland or Jack Nicklaus, when I asked, what made you successful? I began to hear the same answers, even though these people were very different in their personalities, their lifestyles, what they did. And I came to the conclusion that success has its own rules, no matter what you do. Successful people have to do certain things to be successful. And I wrote a book called The Achievement Factors. That book did well, and I started doing keynotes on that subject. Along the way, I reached the decision that I should write a one-man play about a high achiever who embodied those basic common denominators of high achievement. And that's how I chose Lincoln.
Okay. And before you started the interviews, you were talking earlier off this interview that you were an introvert, you weren't comfortable with speaking. So can you talk a little bit about how you started in the early days before this began and what you had to, some of the things you had to overcome to just get to the point of doing these interviews with these famous people on TV?
Nothing with my start suggested how well it would turn out. For example, first sermon I ever gave, my uncle was a pastor of a country church, and I'm in my teen years, perhaps 15, 16. And so he asked me if I will deliver the sermon for the Sunday evening service. And so I prepared this great sermon, all that I know about theology and the Bible, Jesus and forgiveness and Old Testament, New Testament. And I am allotted 45 minutes. And I get up and I tell everything I know, and I look at my watch, and only 8 minutes have elapsed. I thought, I got to do better than this. So I tell them everything, the same thing, twice. And I look at my watch, and 14 minutes have elapsed. Fortunately, my uncle sensed my dilemma, and so he came up, rescued me, and finished the whole 45 minutes for me. But it was a frightening and unsuccessful first experience. As for interviewing, eventually I interviewed U.S. presidents and Nobel laureates and movie stars, and there was nothing to suggest in the start that I would ever be any good at it. I was taking a research methods course at the graduate level in sociology. The professor said, I want you to create a questionnaire, then let's go do some interviews, knock on some doors. We drove out into the country with my interview, 3 or 4 other members of the class, got out of the car. I go up on the front porch, knock on the door, rural family, and I do my first interview. I don't remember how well I did. I just remember doing it and how frightened I was doing it. So the truth about the matter is that there can be a lot of fear the first time you do something, but it may turn out quite well if you decide that it's worth doing and work hard to get really good at it.
Right. And that's a different time. Like when I did my first interview, I actually went back and re-recorded myself over myself. So, when I asked a question, I would just re-record myself asking that question more confidently and concisely on the first 3 episodes I did on this podcast. And that gave me, the confidence to overcome like making a ton of mistakes in the first 3. And then I told myself I couldn't do it after 3. I have to be vulnerable and just like move forward. So that was just when I was getting started. I knew there was a battle that I had, and it's different because back when you're doing your interviews in school, it's not like you're doing it on a podcast or and it's some kind of tech form, so you could do that. So you just have to jump in much harder into that. That's interesting.
Well, that's right. To do what you do, you are jumping in much harder in your case because, you see, the only person who knew how poorly I did my interview was this farmer, and the sermon, only a few people at a country church on a Sunday evening. So if I failed, it was not so bad. The whole world didn't know how badly I did. I'm afraid if I had made a movie of my first interview or my first sermon and had looked at it, I'm not sure I would have continued. I'm sure it would have been so uninspiring that I might have thought, I better find something else to do.
Okay. So now we know where your foundation is and where you started. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe some experiences you've had with Abe Lincoln in the more recent times?
Yes, I'll be happy to. One of the common denominators of very successful people is that they discover something that they can do really well. Many people spend their lives, time, energy, money, working at something that they will never, ever be very good at. One of the people I interviewed was Helen Gurley Brown, who at the time was editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan. She said everybody has a specialty. Somewhere amongst that, those ideas and interests, there's something that you can do really well. She said it took her a long time to find what her specialty was in her case. She said, I have a feel for words. And so that served her well when she became a writer and eventually an editor. Mm-hmm. But she said discovering that specialty is terribly important. Tell you how I discovered doing Lincoln. After I wrote the Achievement Factors, I was invited to give a pro bono speech to a Rotary Club in Ellijay, Georgia, up in the mountains. And I was told before my presentation that there was a member of the Rotary Club who had made a fortune in real estate. He'd retired to the North Georgia mountains, and he could spot the X factor in people. I said, what is the X factor? He said, whether a person has star quality or not. I said, well, I'd certainly like to meet this man, give my speech. I hadn't even started doing Lincoln. It was on my other book.
Your keynote.
Yes. So afterwards, I'm introduced to him. And Jeremy, I did not say, do I have the X factor? Because I was afraid he'd say no. It hurt my feelings. Mm-hmm. So instead I said, I understand you can pick up things in people. He said, I can. I said, did you pick up anything in me? He said, I did. He said, you've missed your calling. Well, by this time, I'm well along in my career. I'm a full professor and been at some very good universities. I've missed my calling. He said, you gave a good speech. You're good. It was a good speech. You're a good public speaker. But you should have been an actor. He said, you would have been a great character actor. Maybe a leading man, but certainly a great character actor. Well, I'd never even been in a high school play. Well, within perhaps the next week, I enrolled in my first acting class. I never saw the man again. It was almost as though he came to give me that message. And I took every acting class that I thought was relevant here in Atlanta. And then I decided I'm going to L.A. to be a part of the acting community there, to take this acting to a higher level, which is what I did. And so...
And that's to surround yourself around other people who are experts in what you're trying to be good at?
Absolutely. That's an important thing. That somehow, if you can, once you have chosen what you want to be or do, or think what you want to be or do, try to expose yourself to the best people in the world at what they do. And so the best actors and the best coaches in the world are in Hollywood, in L.A. And so I went to classes, and I eventually had a coach, took private lessons, and I wanted to elevate the Lincoln performance to be really good, and that has paid off. I performed twice at Ford's Theater where Lincoln was assassinated. I have performed before an audience 2 or 3 times, 3 or 4,000, once 10,000, and one 25,000. That's the biggest audience ever. And I will also tell you that I did the Lincoln performance for 3 people in Denver when there was a blizzard one morning and nobody could get to the performance. And so I did it for 3 people, which, if you think about it, is frightening. But you see, I learned how to give a performance in little tiny acting classes. And so that served me well.
Nice. All right, so you've told me, I've heard you talk a little bit about each of those extreme experiences, but do you mind sharing a little bit about them with our audience here?
All right. Is there one in particular?
Let's talk about the 25,000 one.
The 25,000.
Yeah.
Big convention at the Georgia Dome in Atlanta. I was put on this big convention, put on late at night. I had actually asked around, how do you do a one-man play for 25,000 people? I know how to do it. I've done it many times when I can see the people, look at their faces, I watch their reactions. But you come out on the stage and there are a bunch of cameras and the audience is completely in the dark. And by the way, the performance before me was Leanne Rimes, great country singer who was a sensation. The fear in my mind was that 10,000 people are going to decide they need to go to the restroom when I come out. And I knew I had to grab the audience. I had to hold them. And there's a dichotomy that's sometimes used in communication research between hot and cool, or hot and cold. And so I knew I had to come out hot. So I came out. Abraham Lincoln became a flaming hellfire and brimstone evangelist. That was my style. And I grabbed them. And it was a thrill. Once I had that audience, within 20 minutes I could whisper, and they were leaning forward. Speaking of hellfire and brimstone, being hot, going back to John Wesley, who was the founder of Methodism, John Wesley preached in the open air to huge crowds. And he had another person by the name of Whitfield, and they just drew immense crowds. And someone asked them once, how is it that you're able to hold these crowds when the churches themselves are empty? And his reply was, we set ourselves on fire and people come out to watch us burn.
I like that. Also, diving a little bit deeper into that, you mentioned the whisper aspect, but do you mind going a little bit deeper into the feeling of whispering to such a large audience?
I'm basically an introvert. We talked about that off camera. There is an excitement about holding an audience when they are waiting for your every word. And one of the techniques of speaking is to have a variety, both in pitch and also in rhythm and speed. And so sometimes to go fast, sometimes to go slowly, sometimes to be loud and big, and sometimes to be quiet and small. And sometimes the heavens open, and it works, and the audience is with you, and that connectivity is just wonderful. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Every public speaker will tell you that sometimes they have to work and work and work to get the audience. For whatever reason, the audience is not responding. One of my favorite quotes is from an Italian philosopher, Salvemini, who said, it takes 2 to tell the truth, one to speak, one to listen.
Yeah, I like that. So you talked a little bit about, not here in this interview, but I've heard you talk about how much work you've put into your talk, how you can give an entire speech and you'll go in there and tweak one word and then change that. So do you mind going a little bit into how much prep you've put into being this Abe Lincoln character on stage?
Well, that's a very good question. I spend a lot of time in preparation. Actually, every word of my one-man play, Lincoln Live, has been written down. And every time, incidentally, that I do it, I will come back and go through the manuscript and maybe change a word or suggest I might experiment just a little bit with something that I had never tried before. But it's all written down. Now, the difference between the amateur and the professional, there's a number of differences. One is that the amateur doesn't do much preparation and just expects at the moment the enthusiasm to carry them along. And that often does, and sometimes they're sensational. And then sometimes it doesn't, and they fail. So I have done the preparation. Beyond the preparation, many speakers, what they say, what they do, feels mechanical, learned, memorized. Mm-hmm. So even though I have memorized every bit of it, the next step is to present it in such a way that it doesn't sound memorized, so that it sounds as though I'm just talking, but it really is memorized. John Huston, that's one of the people I interviewed. He's a great director, legendary. He goes all the way back to African Queen, one of the great early movies. He did Night of the Iguana, he did Annie, a number of very famous movies. Mm-hmm. And I asked him what his specialty was, and he replied, I can spot quality quickly, and I can detect its absence. And then he went on to say, I can tell when an actor is acting, not feeling, being. That expression, those words have been terribly valuable to me because now I'm a member of the Television Academy. And so I actually vote on submissions on whether or not they'll get an Emmy. And whenever I'm looking at, say, a made-for-television movie or something, a submission, what I'm looking for is the actor acting or being, feeling. Once you know that, you can look at a movie and you can tell when it feels artificial, and you can tell when the person has lost himself or herself in the part. By the way, it took a while for that to happen to me with Lincoln. I knew I was acting, couldn't change it. And then after a while, I somehow, without knowing how, developed the ability to become Lincoln. So when I'm up there, I am Lincoln. You had asked me earlier, we'd talked earlier about the fact that you wanted to this to be about giving. Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah.
Elaborate on that, and I'll tell you a little story.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the podcast is all about trying to inspire other people who aren't sharing to start sharing. It's like a struggle that I've had for myself where, my car dealership, I've built over 180,000 followers in the car dealership through social media. But I've edited myself out of every picture. I'm not in any audio or video, and just very intentionally behind the scenes. I've built and sold businesses myself. Like, I've got a lot of wisdom and knowledge around entrepreneurship that is not really being shared. And I noticed how much value I added when I would talk to someone that talked about their problems, and I could solve those problems for them or give them leaps in mindsets. I realized that I'm almost doing a disservice by not sharing more. And by thinking more about that and more about my why, I realized that there's a lot more people out there like me who aren't sharing. And I think about some of my friends who are some of the smartest people I know, engineers and stuff like that, and they're not sharing. To think how much the world would be lifted if just my community, shared their wisdom and knowledge with the world is I just think that there's a lot of value to help other people to push out there. Pretty early in the podcast, but I've already had several people telling me like, oh, if Jeremy can do it, I can do it. And then they started a couple things. So I think that's pretty awesome. That's sort of the purpose for the podcast.
I love that. I'm going to tell you a sharing story. I have never told it publicly. I have always felt it would be too self-serving to tell it. But I'm going to tell it in the spirit that I want people to understand what I got out of sharing.
Okay.
I was on a cruise a number of years ago. Our ship docked on a Caribbean island. And as we tourists poured off the ship onto the dock, there was a little ragtag group of teenage musicians sitting beside the platform as we got off. Must have been 4 of them. And they were playing reggae. And I loved it. And I noticed that one of the boys, he was a percussion guy, and he was playing on a cymbal, and the cymbal had split all the way down till there was probably no more than a fraction of an inch left in it, and then it wasn't going to be any good anymore. Mm-hmm. And he was playing with such gusto and enthusiasm, and all of the passengers, almost ignoring them. I loved the music, stopped for a few minutes just to soak it in. I thought, I'm going to do something for that boy. Well, I knew that this big cruise ship had 2 or 3 bands. So I went back on the ship, and I asked around, and I found one of the percussionists. And I said, I want to buy some cymbals from you. And he said, okay, I've got an extra pair. I said, well, how much? I thought he was going to say $25, $50. I'm going to make up the number because it's so many years ago. But I think he said $200. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess there's a certain limit to my generosity. That's a lot of money. I said, I'll do it. So I got $200 and I paid him for the cymbals. Went out, made the tour excursion on the island. At the end of the day, everybody's coming back. I go back to my cabin and I get these beautiful cymbals, shiny brass. And I walk back and this little band is playing their hearts out. Nobody's paying any attention to them. And I walk up to the drummer. He's tapping away on this cymbal. I said, I'd like to give this to you. He thinks, he doesn't know what to make of it. He thinks I'm trying to sell him something. Mm-hmm. And so I said, no, this is yours. He was in shock. He couldn't believe it. It still moves me to remember his reaction. And then once we got aboard and they pulled up the anchor and we began to drift away, he spots me on one of the upper decks, sees me, and he begins to wave at me like this. And as we move out to sea, he continues to wave until he's perhaps no higher than that.
Oh, wow.
And he's still waving at me. Now, I'm going to tell you, I spent $200 to see theatrical performances, athletic events. And I go because I'm going to be entertained. It's going to make me feel wonderful seeing a performance. Nothing that I have ever witnessed as a performance has touched me as much as that boy waving to me until I could no longer see him. And I, perhaps for the first time, fully realized the meaning of the Bible verse, it is more blessed to give than to receive.
And that's powerful.
Well, it affected me tremendously.
Yeah, I can feel that.
And I have continued to look for ways I can give to people. Now, one of the least rewarding experiences is to give something and they don't appreciate it, don't respond in kind, and that's happened to me. But the fulfilling, wonderful moment is when you give from a full heart and the person accepts from a full heart.
Thanks for sharing that.
Glad to do it. And maybe it'll inspire somebody else.
Yeah.
Oh, I will tell you one. Maybe this will help people. This
All right.
giving.
Okay.
We about out of time?
No, we're good. We're good. I was just checking. I can't see it.
Well, because I travel a lot doing presentations. In fact, I still do them. I'll be doing 2 performances of Lincoln for 2 groups of CEOs in New York next week.
Okay.
So I stay in hotels a lot. Well, philanthropy, one of the problems in philanthropy is the philanthropist has to at least think, am I giving to someone worthy of being given to, or is this a con artist or whatever? Is legitimate.
Right.
And so I have embarked for a number of years on a philanthropy program where the person defines themselves as worthy by what they do. And it's a whole category of tens of thousands of people. And these are the women who make up hotel rooms, the housekeepers who clean up my room. They wouldn't be doing that unless they needed to. And often they've got kids, and who's to know how many other people are being supported?
Mm-hmm.
So I decided I'm going to always leave a big tip when I leave my hotel room. Some people don't even tip at all. I always tip. And then sometimes I'll just leave a much bigger tip than they ever thought about doing, maybe a $20 bill, and I'll put it on the pillow. And if I'm staying several days, I've had them write notes to me and tell me that they were able to buy a present for a child. You see, $20, I'll be able to make another $20. But $20 for a housekeeper
Right.
is big.
Yeah.
And I'd love every one of your listeners who, when they stay in a hotel room, to remember the people who are going to clean up afterwards and share. By the way, even though I'm not very active in organized religion anymore, what I internalized has stayed with me. There's another verse I love. He who gives to the poor lends to the Lord. And so I'm just loaning God money. And he pays back
that
with interest.
I've never thought about leaving a tip in the hotel room when staying at a place.
I hope, thank
So
you.
you influenced me just here. So I'm sure this
hope,
would be
and I hope that the many people who listen will start doing it.
right.
And by the way, I have had them give money back, leave it there, because they didn't think it was a gift. They thought it was just something else. So I leave it on the pillow so that they know it's for them.
All right. I appreciate you sharing those stories. Those are awesome. As far as jumping back to the, Abe Lincoln, the career and all that stuff, you started out as someone who struggled to hold the stage for, 10 minutes. And then now you can hold an audience for an hour. Through that journey, are there any major struggles that you went through? And if there's any particular ones that you think were really valuable, do you mind sharing one or two of those?
Well, I will tell you one. I think a lot of people think they're good before they are.
Mm-hmm.
And that certainly was true of me. I think that sometimes I pushed myself out to a big stage when I was not quite ready for it. I'll paraphrase badly a saying that it's better to be, there used to be saying the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was sort of the pinnacle for, say, a comic and so to be on the Tonight Show would launch a career if you were good.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a saying, again, which I will paraphrase badly, but the idea I think you'll get. And that is, it's better to be 2 years too late on the Tonight Show than a week too early. And so I've done a little bit of that, pushing myself out. Maybe it turned out okay, but I wish now that I had done more of my homework before I moved. However, I will have to caution listeners, don't wait till you're perfect before you start doing what you think is good. Go ahead and do the very best you know how, with what you know and with the talents you have, and then look for ways to make it better. And so that has carried me along very beautifully.
So for these instances that you maybe did that too early, do you feel like that helped motivate you to do better next time more because you felt like you could have done a lot better?
Well, I'm going to tell you the downside. I was encouraged maybe a year or two after I started doing the Lincoln performance I had recorded an audio book of that performance. So a very prominent person who heard me urged me to submit that audio book for the Lincoln Prize. Now, the Lincoln Prize, I think now is $50,000 or $100,000, and you have to be really great to get that. And I submitted it. Nobody ever told me, but I think I exposed my Lincoln too soon to the top people in the field. And I think that hurt me. Didn't stop my career.
Right.
But I wish now I had not submitted it and kept on doing it, and then maybe 5 years later submitted something.
Okay, that makes sense. As far as when you've given these talks, I mean, you become Abe Lincoln when you're doing it, so it's inspiring just to see someone who can do that, let alone the speech and the stories that you're telling when you're Abe Lincoln. So have you had people come and approach you after a talk and tell you how big of an impact you've had on them? And are there any like really memorable or heart-touching stories of someone, a specific case or anybody specific that you want to share with us?
Yes, I will. This is the South. And Abe Lincoln has not always been loved in the South, to say it mildly. As a matter of fact, when I was a boy, 200 or 300 years ago, growing up in the South, when I would read the stories of the Civil War, I was hoping the South would win. Sectionalism, patriotism for the section. I was not pulling for Lincoln's team. I understand how old Southerners, and now some young Southerners, how ambivalent they are about Lincoln. Shortly after I started doing Lincoln, I was invited to be the banquet speaker for the Southern Brick Institute. Now, the Southern Brick Institute, its members are not flaming liberals, and they are not Northerners, and many of them are Southern good old boys. They call on lumber yards. They're working with contractors and builders, and so I'm asked to do Lincoln for their annual meeting down near Pensacola, which Southerners affectionately call that area the Redneck Riviera. In any case, I do my Lincoln afterwards. Following my performance, I'm standing around in my costume. 250 members of the Institute are there around. And a man comes up to me and he introduces himself as the CEO of the Columbus Brick Company. And then he proceeds to say, my great-granddaddy was killed the second day at Gettysburg. Nobody needed to tell me which side he was fighting for. And I thought to myself, oh my. And then he said something that was very moving. He said, tonight, I finally got closure.
Oh, wow.
That is a wow, isn't it? That same man, 10 years later, was in charge of programs for the same Brick Institute and invited Lincoln to come back again 10 years later. But what I emphasize in the Lincoln performance is the qualities that make people successful. And one of the qualities, incidentally, that made Lincoln successful was he did not have hatred in his heart. He was making very difficult decisions, many of them. For example, second inaugural address, he ends by saying, with malice toward none, with charity for all. So charity was a special kind of love, a special kind of forgiveness. Incidentally, 8 weeks to the day after Lincoln spoke those words at his second inaugural, they were repeated in Springfield, Illinois, at his funeral.
Well, that's huge. I mean, I think that, you give a talk at one of these conferences and you give someone closure about someone in their family, and to think that, that's someone who came and approached you, but to think how many people you've impacted that have not talked to you, right? Like the unintended consequences from your talks, and how many people you've touched when you've spoken to 25,000 or even a room of 15. If no one comes up and talks to you, you don't know what they brought home that day and how you changed their life. I think it's pretty impactful just to hear like the level of impact that you've had on people. It's awesome.
And I have to say, with complete honesty, that I have to admit that I don't do it for that to happen. I think of myself, my gift is as an entertainer, and I'm entertaining people. And if something transforming like that happens, that's just a big bonus.
That's huge. So going into that a little bit, what is your biggest motivator or driving factor for the Abe Lincoln talk? I mean, it's got to be more than just to entertain. I feel like, it wouldn't have.
Well, that's big.
Is it?
I don't mind making the money. That has been nice too.
Okay.
You see, when you get to the place as a speaker, that people start paying you to do it, that's awfully nice.
And I think it's interesting that a lot of speakers, they have to make a name for themselves as they enter the speaking space, get the credibility, and you've obviously made a name for yourself as far as taking on the character of Abe Lincoln and honing that in, but you're able to piggyback off of that a little bit. And I think that's an interesting take on public speaking that I haven't encountered anybody else taking that path.
And I did take that path out. When I first started doing Lincoln, it was mainly a keynote after-dinner presentation, about 50 minutes long. And then I thought, if I can take this Lincoln performance and make it applicable to the business world, that would work. That means a much larger market. And so I thought, why don't I reconceive this idea, and will be based on the premise that Lincoln is back from the grave.
Okay.
And he's sharing what he has learned about leadership and communication, which is important to any business leader. You need to know how to communicate. You need to know how to lead. And in the case of Lincoln, you need to know how to lead when you don't have a roadmap. Civil War, there's no guidance in the Constitution about what to do in Civil War. He had to figure it out on his own every day. What I do now, and what I'll be doing in New York next week, I will come in and we'll do 50 minutes as Lincoln, in character, in costume. Then I will take a break, and I will come back out of costume. And I will talk with the group about what we can learn from Lincoln that we can apply in a very practical sense in our businesses and our careers today.
That's really interesting because you're giving a talk as Abe Lincoln, and then you're giving that break, and then you're coming back as a different person, and then talking about who you were as like a third person point of view.
Yes. As a matter of fact, even sometimes I will come back out of costume and say that Mr. Lincoln had to leave, and now he's asked his humble assistant to take it from here, which is a little twist of the mind, for me to come out that way. But I have done this hundreds of times with this format.
So as far as motivation goes, then, have you ever struggled with motivation through this career of Abe Lincoln?
Elaborate on that.
It's a little bit different because you're public speaking, but generally, a lot of the social media influencers that I meet, being a social media influencer is a lot of work. There's pressure to be daily posting content out into the web if you're going to be like, an actual growing social media influencer. So it's a lot of work, and you'll have days where you don't feel like you want to do it, or you got to have something that's really pushing you and driving you to have that motivation to continue. And it may be, technical aspects, like maybe, I'm tired of editing these videos, like I wish I could outsource it, but I don't have the income for it. So that's been a motivation issue. People encounter different motivation issues as they pursue their career of influence. And maybe for you, it was more in the early days of honing your speech or getting the transition from acting to being. Are there any maybe other motivation issues that you've encountered over the years that have made you struggle? It could even be money related. Maybe you struggled selling your speaking until you got a critical mass or got the referral base.
Let me grab on that motivation idea.
Okay.
First of all, I am not a big social media influencer. Probably should be. I just wrote a book. My last book was Lincoln and Obama, and I look at the parallels between Obama and Lincoln. There are a number of parallels, incidentally. I have pushed my Facebook page, Lincoln and Obama, and I, a few months ago, recorded an audible. The audible of Lincoln and Obama is out there. So I do that. As far as motivation is concerned, I often am very depressed the night before and morning of a performance. Deeply depressed. Don't want to do it. Force myself to go do it because they paid me and I'm committed and there's an audience waiting for me. And so that's just self-discipline. That's the only reason I do it. Because I don't want to get up, don't want to go out there. Once I'm out there and once I'm performing, it's good. But getting there is usually hard. I'm often deeply depressed. Incidentally, people have suggested maybe that's channeling because Lincoln suffered from depression. He had 2 nervous breakdowns. So I just forced myself to do it. And then once out there, I'm relying on habit, memorized material. So I don't trust emotion.
So how do you overcome that deep depression? I mean, how you talked a little bit about you've got this commitment, audience waiting for you, but how do you get out of bed and get up there and push through to get to the stage when you're in that deep depressed state?
I know if I don't, that it will end my career, that I'll disappoint people. I've made a commitment. You see, once I commit to something, if I tell you I'm going to do something, I'm going to do everything I can to do it. So it's that habit that is lifelong that makes me do it, in spite of myself. By the way, I wrote a book called The Words Lincoln Lived By, and it's a book of quotations of Lincoln. And the lead quote of Lincoln is, "Always remember that your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other one thing." Your own resolution to succeed. In fact, he wrote a letter during the Civil War to a friend of his son who was studying at Harvard, who was about to flunk out. And the President of the United States takes time to write a personal letter to a student at Harvard. And one of the lines in that letter is, you cannot fail if you will not.
I like that. So we're getting closer to the end here, and so I like to ask advice from you. If there was someone you met on the street and they said they want to gain influence, and your level of expertise is through public speaking and writing books, what would be some advice you tell this new emerging person that hasn't started or maybe just started out? What kind of advice would you give to that person on how they can gain influence, or what kind of tips would you give them?
I'll take two of the achievement factors. The first is, I would say, discover something that you can do that you think you have a good chance of becoming really good at. You may not even see it yourself. In my case, the final scene, somebody else saw it in me, the acting that I didn't see in myself.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a number of ways of finding what you could be good at. Sometimes somebody else will see it. One of the people told me once when I said, find what you're good at, he said, I'm really good at solving problems. And I said, well, how did you discover this? And he said, I had a job where I had to solve problems. And one night I was working at my computer, thought to myself, I'm enjoying this, and I'm good at it. So that's the key. Find something that you're really good at and enjoy it. I've met people who are really good at something and they don't like it. Mm-hmm. So the magic in life is when you discover what you're good at and you like doing it.
And you even said if you could be good at it. So if you like doing it and you could be good at it,
getting good at it is not that much of a chore.
Right.
Because you're working at what you enjoy. And the more you do it, now, you see, then the second part is becoming good at it. You see, you have to not just know what you could be good at, but become good at it. There are steps to do that, like I said, exposing yourself to the very best people that you possibly can. For example, in Lincoln's case, when he determined that he was going to become a lawyer, whenever a very good lawyer would come to the courthouse to argue a case, he'd make sure he was in the audience to study the person who was really good. And he borrowed books and made friendships with good people who were good at what he wanted to be. He started mirroring, that's a term we use today, mirroring what he saw in the people who were good. In fact, there's a rule that I sometimes give in my seminar. If you want to be really good at anything, find somebody who's really good at what you want to do and be, and study them and do what they do.
That's great advice. Now, if you were to meet someone who's already a public speaker, let's say, and they're established, they're doing great, what would be some advice that you have for someone who's already established that you feel like maybe that you're doing that's different than the average public speaker, that you feel like could help level up someone else?
I would give them the same advice I'd give to the beginning speaker in this respect. I would tell them to learn to find some joy in the successes that they have. I believe in deferring gratification, but you don't want to defer everything. So I would say, learn to enjoy now, not always enjoy some future date that may never come. Enjoy this moment. Get something out of this moment. Do this moment well. And the next one will take care of itself.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that. Well, Gene, I appreciate you coming here on the podcast today. I'd like to end the episode by giving you an opportunity to just share anything that you want to share that maybe you haven't shared yet, and then maybe talk about anything that people may want to go find you, or maybe talk about some of the books that you've written. Just really anything. Here are some last moments.
Well, I guess I'll do a little plug, and that is the Audible that I just recorded, Lincoln and Obama. I narrate it myself, and I wrote the introduction myself, and it tells a lot about my early experience growing up in the South and how my opinion of Lincoln has evolved. I would urge them to give that a listen. By the way, I think at Audible you can listen to a free sample, so
Yeah.
they can test that.
I'll put a link to that on the website.
I
as
would
well.
love that.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is I have a newsletter called the Achievement Digest. And if any of your listeners send me an email, and maybe the best email, can I give the email address?
Yeah, you can give it, and then I'll also put it on the
it's
website.
Abe, A-B-E, like Abe Lincoln, at mindspring.com, mindspring.com. And all they have to do is subscribe. That's all they do. And I will put them on, and we'll do it about 4 times a year. And I tell stories of high achievers and Lincoln quotes and that sort of thing. And there's no advertising or anything in it, except it does mention that I do speeches. But other than that, there's no, hard sell or anything. So I'll do that free if they want to.
Sure.
So that it has been a very wonderful journey. Sometimes, maybe most or all the time, when you start out doing something, you never know where it will end or what it will evolve into.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone had told me when I was in my 20s that the last chapter of my life I would be going around the world trying to convince people that I'm the 16th president, I was no way.
Well, Gene, thanks again for coming on the show. I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your journey and being vulnerable with us and sharing about your generosity. Those stories were awesome as well.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. I look forward to seeing your influence keep on growing over these next few years.
My pleasure.
Well, that concludes the interview. Thanks so much for sticking it through to the end. Again, Gene, thanks so much for coming on the show. I think it's really inspiring how Gene started out so green and has grown to interview some of the world's most influential people. And he also became someone who's capable of going on stage and speaking in front of such large audiences and being able to move them. I can't imagine the feeling of standing on a stage and speaking to 25,000 people and being able to whisper and know that everybody's on the edge of their seats waiting for every word. I mean, that's got to be such a surreal experience. And I also think that's really interesting how he's done this performance hundreds of times. So you got to think that it's completely different from when he first started doing it, the first 10, even 20 or 30 or 50 times, to now that he's done it hundreds of times. He's really honed this performance down. When Gene was talking about that, it made me think of Elaine Fluker from episode 15. She said, you can't compare your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 20. Gene's put so much time and energy into doing this Abe Lincoln performance. He's got hundreds of performances behind his belt. He's put the hard work and sweat and tears into earning the skills that it takes to do that. I mean, to think back that he couldn't hold the stage for 10 minutes to now doing this performance, I mean, that's practiced skill that he's dedicated his life to. Gene shared a ton of tips with us today, and I'll just summarize some of my takeaways real quick for you guys. He said, don't wait till you're perfect. You got to get out there and put something out there at some point. He talked about a story when he put himself out there a little too early, and that worked a little bit in his detriment. But he also said, don't wait till you're perfect. And I think it's important to just, find a balance that works for you and move forward with that. Gene really emphasized that you need to find something that you're good at and that you enjoy. Specifically, he said, find something that you're really good at or discover something that you could be really good at. And that may be something that you can't see yourself. So you need to enroll others to help you explore this. Ask your friends or your family and ask them, what is it that you're good at? And get some outside perspective, because you may not even see some of the things that you're good at. Gene talked a lot about surrounding yourself around people who are better than you at what it is that you want to be good at. So you want to expose yourself to the very best people. He suggested that you could find somebody who's really good at what you want to do and be, and study them and do what they do. I really liked how Gene talked about learning to find joy in the success that you have now and learn to enjoy your now. Don't try to enjoy some future date that may never come. Don't stay completely future focused and miss the current moments. So you need to enjoy the moment that you're in. He said, do this moment well, and the next one will take care of itself. I thought that was pretty powerful. And lastly, he said, sometimes when you start something, you never know where it'll end or where it'll evolve into. I liked how he closed with just a nice message, and it was pretty powerful because he talked about how when he was in his 20s, he would have never imagined that he would be speaking in front of such large audiences as he is today, especially given that he's an introvert and struggled so much with public speaking back in those days. Gene's someone who really believes in giving, and he shared a very vulnerable story with us today about how he was on a cruise and he bought that symbol for the musician on the island. He started that by saying he's never shared that story publicly with anybody, and in person, because this was an in-person interview, you could really feel the emotion radiating off him. It was a very emotional and impactful story for him, and I applaud him for sharing that with us today, and hopefully some listeners can have some takeaway from that. Speaking of generosity, if you get one takeaway from this episode, start leaving tips in hotel rooms. It makes a really big difference for people's lives. Oh, there's one other thing I want to talk about. When Gene was talking about his why, he talked about how his passion is to entertain, to be really skilled entertainer. His deep passion isn't necessarily to impact people or to move people. It's more to entertain them and be a really high quality and skilled entertainer. During the interview, I think I struggled to recognize that. So I kept diving deeper, and I think that I couldn't go deeper because I already had found it and just didn't click for me as an interviewer, that his why is genuinely to entertain, and having some time after the interview to reflect, I think that's a really powerful why, and that's exactly what his why is. And that's just something that I didn't catch right on the spot, but it's something that I realized after. And so I'm just, I'm learning the interview, and it's just a different why that I didn't expect. I never met anybody that their why was to entertain. So I think that's awesome that Gene shared that with us. Hopefully, if there's anybody out there whose why is to entertain, you can resonate a lot with what Gene shared. And I'm going to try to be more open when I hear people talk about their whys, so that I don't get caught off guard again like that, because I feel like it sort of made a bit of an awkward moment because I was struggling and trying to dive deeper into something that didn't need to go deeper into. So how's my journey going here at the Why Influence podcast? Well, this is my first in-person interview. All my interviews so far have been remote, so I could just type on my computer, take notes. I could look away for a second and look back, and there's no level of awkwardness. I feel like, learning all the equipment and setting up, there's a lot of components to doing an in-person interview, and I feel like I couldn't really move right. I was sort of awkward if I had like arm motions, and same with Gene. He was sort of trapped with one arm going underneath the mic on one side. So the physical setup was a little bit awkward, so I'm going to try to improve that next time I do an in-person interview. But it's just all part of learning experiences to get this down. This interview specifically didn't really follow the normal flow of my other podcast interviews. It was more conversational and went down a few rabbit holes. Not that it's a bad thing, but I'm just curious, how did you guys think it went? Did you like the interview and how it sort of went on a few side tangents and dove down deep into certain side topics? Or do you like sticking to the conventional format that I've had so far in my earlier podcasts? I'd love to hear from you guys, so you could just send me a private message through social media. You could shoot me an email through the website, or the best way to interact would be to join our Discord group. It's like a Facebook group or a WhatsApp group, but it's on an app called Discord. You can do it through the web browser or a mobile app. There's a link in the footer of my website, whyinfluence.com, and if you go in there, you can interact with me, you can interact with other listeners. It's basically where our community is sitting. So if you want to send me a message, I'm going to hear it. You can send it through social platforms or email. But if you want to interact with other people who are listening and maybe working on their journeys and want to share it in our community, Discord is where it's going to be. So just go to our website and scroll to the footer, and on the right side, you'll see the link to join the Discord group. I'm pretty proud of myself for doing my first in-person interview. I think it went really well, and I think Gene has a ton of value, a ton of wisdom to share, and I'm happy to have extracted some of his why and some of his wisdom out for you guys to take in. Now, if you want to find out more about Gene or maybe see one of his Abe Lincoln performances, you can go to our website, whyinfluence.com, and you can navigate to episode 17. That's Gene's episode. And we're going to have links to the Lincoln and Obama book. We're going to have links to other books that Gene wrote. We're going to have links to his website. We're going to have embedded video of his Abe Lincoln performance. So if you want to see a clip from one of his performances of him on stage in costume and doing his performance as Abe Lincoln, then just navigate to our website and you'll see it in there. You can also subscribe to his newsletter. There'll be a link for signing up for the Achievement Digest newsletter that Gene talked about during the interview. One last thing I'd like to talk about, which is I just got back from Podcast Movement, where I spoke and did my first public talk, super scary. And I spoke in front of 300 to 400 people. And it went pretty well. I got some awesome pictures and I made it through it and I inspired somebody. I posted some stuff about that on Instagram, so if you want to go check that out, you can. I'm going to talk more about that in my update episode. Once I hit 20 interviews, I'm going to do another update episode where Nathan interviews me, so just stay tuned for that. That's coming soon. If you made it this far, then I'm going to ask you for one favor. I'm putting myself out there. I'm doing all this work on this podcast, and there's one thing that you could do that would mean a lot to me, which is if you have a friend or a family member who you think would benefit from listening to some of these episodes from the podcast, maybe an introvert who's struggling to share, or maybe somebody who's not going big enough for whatever it is that they're trying to do, I would really appreciate you to share this podcast with somebody. It could be a family member, it could be a friend, but if you can just send it to one person, that would be the best way to help me out and help out our mission. Anyway, thanks so much for listening to this episode in its entirety. Sorry this one ran a little bit long, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Thanks.